So your work for the Green Institute explores the intersection between the TPP and asylum seekers. This is very interesting. Can you tell us about that?
Okay, so the editors of the Green Agenda, which is a newsletter that goes out to all Green members and supporters, at Green being the Australian Greens Party, asked me and commissioned that article because they want to stimulate some sort of a debate about why we are not really having any traction whatsoever on the issue of asylum seekers, and the only policy movement in that area is the one that is going backwards, and it's reached a point where I wake up every day thinking, okay, so how far is the bottom going to shift today? And so there is this feeling, I think, that what we've been doing so far is not necessarily effective, because in a lot of ways activists have not connected the broader social, political and economic context to the asylum seeker policy.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to do. In fact, that's what kind of got my interest into the TPP. And not just TPP, but the broader regime, as I call it, that's been in place, say, for the past 15 years. Since 9/11.
Yeah.
So since 9/11 events, we've seen this incredibly intensified outsourcing of government services to private corporations.
Yeah.
And it's not just about neoliberal agenda that is a part of it. In the case of asylum seekers, it's really about outsourcing the moral hazard that the government has.
Yes.
In basically inflicting deliberate torture and trauma on people who are already traumatized enough.
Yes.
That's a deterrence model. So the more I thought about it, and the more I thought about borders, because what we have is pretty much the state borders shifting and moving all the time with different effects on trade. People stand to lose a lot if the TPP is brought in, but there is this almost like conspiracy to divert attention from that and onto this group of people who seek asylum from persecution, torture, in most cases actually certain death. And so we're talking about a few thousand people. There's about 30,000 asylum seekers in the community now, but we're talking about a few thousand people on Manus and Nauru. We're talking about, according to the government, the 20 boats have been stopped since its policy was implemented, with about 650 roughly people on board, although I suspect that that number would be higher. Still, that is, you know, in terms of the numbers of people, we are talking very, very small number of people, and yet this is about border protection, and yet borders are being relaxed when it comes to the interests of multinational corporations and the profit making that they are pursuing under the TPP.
Well, so it's amazing. It's amazing that the borders are so amorphous. I mean, we've got amorphous borders coming in with the TPP, and we've got amorphous borders with our policy on asylum seekers, with the excision of all the different places where you can actually apply for a visa upon coming to the country.
That's right.
It seems that, and the thing is with your article is that you really explored that whole idea that borders are amorphous. They're not these rock solid things that we sort of perceive them to be, you know, which further puts paid to the whole lie that there's somehow a queue somewhere that people can join to come to the country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it does. And so I wanted to kind of stimulate people to think a bit more about the broader context in which this asylum seeker policy is being played out. And the more I researched, the more I realized just how much, how beholden we are to the whole regime of lies and deception and sins of omission, as I call them, because we are not being told about the implications about the TPP in the mainstream media, or it basically comes to shows like this, and the alternative media and social media where we can actually make some traction.
So it seems that the government is echoing somehow this whole idea of confidentiality, like corporate confidentiality commercial in confidence in regards to their policy with the asylum seekers.
Yes, it's operational matters. And
it's operational matters, yeah, and on all this kind of thing. However, our government's always had operational matters, and I'm just wondering how this whole thing about asylum seeking is different to every other operational matter that governments have.
Governments exercise control in what they actually tell us about policy where they're not required to report to Parliament on what is going on. Even when they are asked questions in the Senate, those questions are unanswered. So there is this real, if you'd like, lack of freedom of speech, the real freedom of speech. But the whole idea of the freedom of speech is actually invoked in support of organisations such as People in Reconstruction, various people who are actually, the real Nazis, United Patriot Front, and so on. So the freedom of speech argument is manipulated as much as anything else, and that's kind of the danger. And I think that what we really need to do is we need to get galvanised around this issue on a holistic basis, which is what I try to do with the article. I want to make different connections between seemingly disparate themes, such as the TPP, such as asylum seekers. The whole idea of where we are at this point in time, in this very late capitalism, really does need a much more holistic approach than what we have been doing so far. The movement out there is very disparate. And that's actually my bigger concern than what the government's doing. My bigger concern is that the movement out there is very disparate in terms of approaching these issues. So we've got, and I have been active in the refugee movement, initially in Melbourne in the early 2000s and then here. And I've seen it happen over and over again, is that we are looking at the issue of asylum seeking in isolation from issues like the TPP and what's going on with the whole free trade regulations and what the state does. And I think we actually really do need to start making some connections if we are going to be more effective. So I'm working with the Greens. I'm hoping to engage Amnesty International. Of course, everyone is welcome to come on board. The more the merrier. But I'm primarily targeting those organisations because I think that they hold a lot of potential in terms of the activism around this issue.
Yeah, it seems to me a very interesting thing that I've been thinking about is the involvements of companies too in the internment of asylum seekers. These big companies, not only does it allow the government to morally wash their hands of the whole thing, it allows them to operate under secrecy.
Yes.
Is the lack of reporting, the ability for the government to say, well, you guys don't have a right to know. And it sort of reminds me of what happened, in the 1940s. With certain companies that are still around today making big profits.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
And I mean, when people talk about these camps that they have in Manus and whatnot, they're referring to them now in common parlance as concentration camps. Have you noticed?
That's because they are.
Yeah, and precisely.
You'll see that, in the article I obtained photos of the centre that was built, the transit centre, for people who have been found to be refugees, and the millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, in fact, $420 million, in fact, that went to the company that built them. And you go and have a look at these photos and you tell me whether that really looks like it's worth $420 million.
Yeah.
I suspect not. There's but much bigger interests here. There's the interests of the the PNG government. There is in terms of the deck mill company that built those transit centres, has improved infrastructure. There is this kind of whole neo-colonial PNG, having been an Australian colony, whole neo-colonial bent to it, quite frankly. There's so much that can be said about it. And I'm actually going to write another piece about Manus Island and the strategic geopolitical significance that it has for Australia. It's no coincidence that this camp was built on Manus Island.
Yeah, it also seems to be a continuation of colony, in that you get a foot in the door in some of these places, and there's always some deeper things going on, you know.
That's right.
Once you've got the foot in the door,
yeah,
then that's how it starts. That's how colonialism starts.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And that's also the outsourcing of the government responsibility for what happens to these people. I actually think that if it wasn't for that, and if it wasn't for the companies that are involved in the system of mandatory detention in the form in which it is now, not the form in which it started under the Labor government in the 90s, I actually think you'd have a government finding it very difficult to implement this policy.